All right, today we're jumping right into one of the most persistent and frankly misunderstood issues in international law, the legal case for Somaliland's recognition. Let's dig in. Think about this for a second. For more than 30 years, a stable, functioning democracy has existed in the Horn of Africa, and yet it has zero formal international recognition. It's a country in limbo. But here's the big question, the one we're tackling today. What if the legal arguments used to keep Somaliland in this limbo are just wrong? What if they're based on a total misunderstanding of the facts and the law?
To get to the bottom of this, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the creation of the modern Somali state. And what you'll find is a union that, legally speaking, may never have actually happened.
Okay, this timeline is where it all starts to unravel. On June 26, 1960, the state of Somaliland gets its independence. It's recognized by over 35 countries, including the UK. It's a sovereign state. A day later, it passes a law to unite with its southern neighbor. But here's the catch. 5 days later, the newly independent Somalia passes a completely different law. They never signed Somaliland's version.
And this is the absolute crucial point. Under international law, for a treaty or a union between two states to be valid, both sides have to agree to the exact same text. You can't just have two different documents. Somaliland passed its law, Somalia passed another. There was no single, unified, mutually signed agreement. Legally, there was no meeting of the minds.
So, what did the people in Somaliland think? Well, the numbers speak for themselves. When a referendum was held in 1961 to try and retroactively fix this legal mess, the turnout in Somaliland was tiny, less than 17%. And of those who did show up to vote, more than 60% rejected it. There was simply no democratic mandate for this union in the north.
But here it is, the legal bombshell. You don't have to take my word for it. In 1963, the highest court in the entire country, the Somali Supreme Court, ruled on this very issue. They found that legally, no valid union existed between Somaliland and Somalia. They said this while acquitting northern officers, arguing that Somalia had no jurisdiction over them because the union itself wasn't valid.
So with that shaky, or rather non-existent, legal foundation in mind, let's tackle the #1 argument you hear today against recognition. It's this idea of territorial integrity. And honestly, it's based on a massive misunderstanding of what that principle actually means. So let's just define our terms. What is territorial integrity? The UN Charter is really clear. It's a rule that stops one country from using force or threatening to use force against another country. The key words here, the ones you need to remember, are threat or use of force.
And if there was any doubt, the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, clarified this when it ruled on Kosovo's independence. They explained that territorial integrity is about external threats between states. It does not stop a region from changing its political status internally. It governs how states interact with each other, not what happens inside them. And that brings us to the bottom line. Recognizing Somaliland is a diplomatic act. It is not an act of war. It is not a threat or use of force against Somalia. Therefore, the whole territorial integrity argument just doesn't apply here. It's legally irrelevant.
Right, so if the legal argument is that weak, what's really going on? What's the actual fear that's stopping countries from acting? Well, it's not about law, it's about politics. It's the fear of setting a precedent, the fear of so-called balkanization across Africa.
But this is where the whole situation gets incredibly ironic, because the African Union's own core principle, the sanctity of colonial borders, actually makes one of the strongest cases for recognizing Somaliland, not against it.
Just look at this timeline. It creates a kind of temporal paradox. In 1960, Somaliland becomes a free and independent state within its established colonial borders. 3 years later, in 1963, the Organization of African Unity is created, and it decides to make respecting those colonial-era borders its central rule. Somaliland's statehood literally predates the very organization and the very rule now being used to deny its existence.
So here's the paradox in a nutshell. The African Union's mission is to protect the borders left behind by the colonial powers. Somaliland's entire claim is based on the exact borders of the former British Somaliland Protectorate. Recognizing Somaliland isn't violating the AU's charter, it's actually upholding it.
And hey, don't just take it from me. This isn't some fringe theory. In 2005, the African Union sent its own fact-finding mission to Somaliland. Their conclusion? They said the case was unique and that the 1960 Union was, and I quote, never ratified. That's from the AU itself.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together now. This leads us to the final and I think the most accurate legal argument.
This is not a case of secession, of breaking away from a country. This is a case of restoration, of bringing back a state that legally never ceased to exist.
And there's a perfect international precedent for this. Lithuania. When it broke away from the Soviet Union in 1991, the world didn't treat it as a new country. It was recognized as the restoration of the independent state that had been illegally swallowed by the Soviets. The logic is identical for Somaliland. A pre-existing independent state, an invalid union, and now a restoration of that original sovereignty.
So when you lay it all out, this state continuity argument is incredibly strong. It's factually accurate, backed by that 1963 Supreme Court ruling. It's compatible with the AU's own rules. It's precedent safe, because it's about restoration, not creating a new secessionist movement, and it's legally sound under modern international law. And we can't talk about this in a purely academic way. There's a real human cost here. The restoration in 1991 only happened after a horrific civil war where the Siad Barre regime committed genocide against the Isaaq people. For 3 decades since, Somaliland has built a functioning, stable democracy while being cut off from the international aid and investment that it needs, all because a 30-year reality on the ground is being ignored over legal misunderstandings.
So in the end, the legal case isn't about creating something new. It's about acknowledging a country that was never legally extinguished. The evidence, from court rulings to the AU's own findings, is clear and consistent. The only question left is, when will international politics finally decide to catch up with the facts?